Nation in Conversation, proudly brought to you by AFGRI, Fort Knox, Hinterland, Monsanto, Nedbank, NWK and Sendex. Agriculture is our wisest pursuit because it will in the end contribute most to real wealth, good morals and happiness.
Good day and welcome to Nation in Conversation from me, Theo Foster. At Nation in Conversation, we discuss pertinent issues that have an impact on our daily lives. Today we talk about the complexity of the food value chain and why it is important for us as the consumer. You can follow us on Twitter at Nation Converse or the website nationinconversation.co.za. Joining me in the studio today is Tabi Nkosi, Senior Economist at Agri SA, and Dr. John Purchase, Chief Executive of Agbus. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John, I'd like to start with you. The food value chain, what is it?
Yeah, if you look at what we call the agro-food value chain, it basically starts with the consumer and what his preferences are for food, whether it's starches, proteins, etc. And then obviously he purchases, or he or she purchases that at the retailer. That can be the ShopRite Checkers or Pick n Pays and the Spars, etc. But then going into the production to provide them with the food are obviously the processors, and then further back down the value chain are the storers and also the logistics people, and then obviously you have the farmers, and then you have the service providers and the input suppliers to the farmers. That's your fertilizer, your chemical industry, your seed industry, and there are many others, and then also your financiers and your insurance business people. So that whole chain, right from the input suppliers right up to the consumer in the end is basically your value chain. And it differs. It could be in your cereals, it could be in your dairy products, it could be in your wine, it could be in your animal or in poultry industries. All of them have their own subsector food value chains. The most important is what does the consumer want in terms of price, in terms of quality, and preference in terms of the product he or she wants.
Tabi, why is it so important to have an effective value chain?
It's essentially important because people need food on the plate. It's very difficult to get already processed food from the farm. I think very few people want to end up with a whole cow on their table or a piece of seed, so it's very important that the food is available to the consumer in a way that they can consume it, in a way that is affordable and in a safe manner. So you need an effective food value chain to ensure that that happens.
Affordable and safe. Are we there?
Yes, I think if you look at food security, one of the three of the most critical issues are safe, nutritious, affordable food for the population. And basically an agro-food value chain starts with a good policy around food security. And food security is a multidimensional, fairly complex situation. Now, if you go and look at for different measures that you have in terms of your food security index, a great one is probably the best known one is the Economist's Food Security Index, and they compare different countries. South Africa is actually rated as good performer. It's in the top 30% of food value chains in the world. Yes, we do provide good, affordable food of good quality to our people. So the Economist tells us that. If you also look at the Living Standards Index that the economists themselves developed, and where food is a very important part of your living standard, our cities like Joburg and Cape Town are of the cheapest in the world. And again, the food plays a very important role. And then you can even go and look at your Big Mac Index, where ours is of the cheapest. Our Big Macs is of the cheapest in the world. So, and it's also, while they use it as an indication of the strength of your exchange rate, it's actually a better indication of what food costs in that country. So there are many issues that indicate to us that we actually have good to even very good food security. Our problem in food security in South Africa is not the agro-food system so much. It's that there are too many poor people that don't have discretionary household income to can purchase enough food for a daily sustenance in terms of food. And that is a legacy of apartheid. That is a legacy of our education system over many years, that people can't access the economic terrain fully to be able to earn a living to buy the food. So that is it's a different problem that we have. And yes, there are different measures. Stats SA, I think, put that figure at about 13% of our population. Other figures from the Human Sciences Research Council put it at 20% of our population. The Oxfam came up with a 40% figure the other day. So it differs from who does that study. But the point is, generally, we have pretty good food security in South Africa, but we must also ensure that the other people that, or people that don't have access to food, have the means to buy that food. I think that's why we have a grant system to enable people at least to purchase basic food needs.
Toby, what is the risks if a food value chain doesn't work? If it's not balanced, if it's not, margins are not properly shared amongst all the people, what do we end up with?
The ultimate risk is, of course, food insecurity. So that is hunger.
That means I walk into a store and there's nothing.
Absolutely. Or you walk into a store and there is just one of something, because essentially you want a balanced diet. And it doesn't help that the food chain only provides for one type of food. So you're really looking at food insecurity on a much broader scale if the food system fails.
Are we going to see, if I look at the challenges, obviously government has to play a role. But first of all, let's start with some of the bottlenecks. Where can government assist in taking out the bottlenecks?
Yes, I think government plays a very important role in this agro-food value chain, primarily in two concepts. The first is the whole legislation and regulatory environment. They write the rules of the game. They're also the referee of the game. But on the other hand, government also has a number of state-owned enterprises that facilitate the whole business chain. It might be through electricity supply like Eskom. It might be through Transnet and Portnet services, harbours and trains for logistics, etc. So there are different roles that a government can and must play. Obviously, that role definition is critically important, because if government starts intervening too much in the private sector space, private sector become risk averse, and they don't want to see government as role player and referee, because then it becomes biased in the whole process. So these are the issues that we constantly engage government with. What works, what doesn't work, what role must private sector play, what role must government play in this whole process. But government is very important.
After the break, we will talk about the National Development Plan, what it expects of the food sector, and what are the opportunities in that respect. Nation in Conversation will be back right after this break. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. Today we talk about the food value chain, the opportunities and the challenges. Tabi, the National Development Plan place a focus on agriculture and also the agro-processing industry. Where does that fit into this discussion?
I think the National Development Plan looks at the food value chain in a very broad perspective. So it addresses the ability of people to afford food, which is what John touched on earlier. So it talks about how do we increase income so that people are able to afford balanced meals. But it also then talks about how you improve efficiency within the food value chain. So how do you make energy provision more effective? How do you start to look at things like disaster management? But then it also talks about the role of the food value chain in creating jobs, which I think is a very, very important aspect. The NDP talks about creating 1 million jobs in agriculture and agro-processing. And that can only happen when you have an effective food value chain, because a healthy food value chain will be able to create those jobs.
John, is it possible in terms of the creating the jobs in the food value chain?
I think we can create more jobs, but we're going to have to do market development very strongly too. In other words, while our markets in South Africa are pretty saturated, we're going to have to strengthen our market segment that we have in Europe. In Africa, it's grown very well, but we also have to diversify into Middle East and the Far East, etc. So market development is at the core of this, because once you have that, you have the pool, you can get new entrants in, new entrepreneurs, more labor coming into the system. So market development is going to be fundamental to that. But the National Development Plan emphatically says that. It says that we must have a positive trade balance, maintain a positive trade balance for agriculture and agricultural products. In other words, we must be a net exporter of agricultural products. But to do that, we need that market development. There is, I think, some criticism in terms of the National Development Plan, Chapter 6, in that I think it presupposes an ideal policy environment, and we don't have that ideal policy environment in agriculture. There's too much uncertainty around land reform, around the investment climate, a rand dollar that fluctuates immensely. So there are economic constraints and also infrastructural constraints around the roads, the harbors, especially electricity. So we don't have that ideal situation. So whether we will reach the 1 million jobs, I think is debatable. But I think it makes some very good points around the competitiveness of our value chains that Tabi also referred to, and what we need to do, creating capabilities, capacities within people, mentoring, etc., to up our skills level, because that is absolute fundamental to competitive value chains or efficient value chains. It makes a lot of good points around that. So I think there's quite a lot of relevance still today. Perhaps some of the targets need to be relooked, reviewed, because that was drafted a couple of years ago. And you know, in the agri-food value chain system, or the competitive global system, as far as that's concerned, there are a number of changes that have already taken place. So one must keep updating it, reviewing it, make sure that it's still relevant to the challenges that we have today.
Tabi, John placed a big emphasis on the relative roles of private sector enterprise, private capital, and the role of the government. And obviously, in the long term, we all want, as you were saying, we want food that's reliable, that's affordable, that's on our tables. How should that relationship be managed?
I think there need to be very clear lines. The role of government must be very clear. And in my opinion, that role needs to be to provide an enabling environment. So to provide the proper investment environment, the proper regulatory framework to be able to do business. So we can't have government kind of stepping into the role of business, because business is then supposed to bring capital and operate within that environment that government has created. And I think sometimes the lines get a bit blurred. Then you run into problems. But I think essentially those two roles are very distinct. And in countries where that distinction has been made, that has worked very well.
The current discussions between government and the rest of the agriculture sector, the rest of the food chain, what is the premise of those discussions?
Yes, we have a lot of discussions with government on a number of forums, whether it's in land reform, whether it's in the agri-food value chain. Just for example, or the Presidential Business Working Group, where we had a discussion with our cabinet and the president a month or so ago, where agriculture was the number one subject on the agenda, together obviously with mining because of the problems there. The ANC has just released a week or two ago their draft discussion documents around economic policy for the National General Council in Durban that's happening early in October. And fortunately, they made these available also in the public domain, and they are engaging with us next week exactly on the agri-food policy changes that they want to implement. Now, there are certain proposals there that can certainly work. I think there are a couple of analysis points that I don't think they've made correctly, and we need to engage with them on that. And some of the proposals that they've made, I think, are controversial, and they actually indicate to the point that Tabi make, where the lines get blurred and government becomes too interventionist in the system, and then it becomes a negative impact on the system. And I think that's where the discussion will focus on. What works, what doesn't work, what intervention can you allow, because in a developing economy that we have, you're going to need certain interventions. We must just make sure that those interventions add value and don't detract from what I call a very good value agri-food system that we have in South Africa.
Is our food system adaptable enough to changing environments, specifically in terms of the consumer?
I think it has no choice. I mean, in this environment, the consumer is king. So the consumer dictates how they want their food to look, how they want the chickens to be raised. So do you want your chickens to spend some time outside? How do you want...
And the value chain needs to adapt to that.
Exactly.
Otherwise, they're going to lose.
Exactly. They want to know, where does this grape come from? What kind of farm? And increasingly, we're seeing that in the Western countries, and it's coming here as well. So really, without adapting, I think the food value chain will die because the consumer dictates.
And therefore, you need agility, but
Exactly.
You need a sound structure that works. After the break, we're going to talk about the future, the opportunities, and also some of the bottlenecks that can be addressed. Nation in Conversation will be back after this break. Welcome back. This is Nation in Conversation. We talk about the food value chain and the importance of the food value chain. John, our food value chain actually competes against the rest of the world, because I can get a foreign product on my table if the South African food value chain is not efficient. How do we approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to be competitive in the global agri-food value chain. And it's all private sector space. We need to go and see how efficient we are in terms of putting our products also on the international markets at a price that we can still make profit out of our products. So obviously competitiveness is absolutely fundamental. So we have to be efficient in our input supply. Our farmers have to be efficient and productive in their process, as do the logistics, as do the storage, as do the processing, right into the retail sector, where the consumer then obviously has choice. But it is so. Our system is open. We compete with many countries that also subsidize directly or indirectly their food system, or they have high tariff walls, which inhibits us in terms of getting market access into those markets. So while it's an open system, there are also certain unfair measures that we have to compete against. But it doesn't then give us the right to go and overprotect and over-support with subsidies our own sector. We must still be mean and lean in terms of our approach. In other words, drive efficiency, drive productivity through new technology, etc., to make sure that we produce is as efficient as possible. It's basically produce more with less. And that's the measure of productivity, basically. And that's where we've got to drive it.
If you take the stance of purely protecting industries, the result is inefficient industries, and in the end, everybody, the consumer and the taxpayer, pays for that.
Exactly.
It's not a quick fix.
No. I think we must understand, if you make your tariffs too high, or if you start subsidizing inputs, it skews markets, and there's a cost to society involved. It's basically a tax. A tariff is a tax that government then ends. But then your food prices get higher, and if you don't do this properly, you can have 20, 25, 30% food price hikes. And that will lead to huge instability. We could get food riots in South Africa. So we've got to get that balance right in terms of how much protection versus driving efficiency in our value chains. To me, the ultimate test of efficiency is always, can we put our product on the international market at a price that we're still making profit at, and you can sell it on the international market. So relative terms of trade is basically what we're looking at, and that is critical to our situation. What we must do is we must maintain that competitiveness, but then also, and government plays a big role in that efficiency, because the more regulation you get, the more blockages from their side, inefficient Eskom or whatever, just chases up your cost of doing business. And we must keep our cost of doing business as low as possible. So if you have over-compliancy, over-regulation, it means extra cost to business. So we must try and manage our costs down to be competitive.
Darby, in terms of quick fixes or things that can make a quick change, what is needed?
I don't know if there's anything that can be a quick fix, because I think the challenge is... It is broken. I think there's a lot of things that are broken, but I'm just not sure that the solutions are as easy as just being a quick fix. I mean, we're looking at challenges such as Eskom, as John alluded to. I mean, for us as a food value chain to be able to produce cheaply and to be able to compete internationally, our production costs need to be sustainable and they need to be manageable. So if you have very high energy costs like what we have currently, and you have energy uncertainty, that becomes a bit of a problem. We know that there has been some progress on Eskom's front in terms of the power stations that they are currently bringing online, but I mean, that is not a quick fix. You know, then you have things like policy uncertainty. You need foreign investors to start looking at South Africa as a haven in which to start testing new products, in which to start opening up new markets. But that can only happen if there's an environment that incentivizes that kind of investment. And I think there's been a lot of challenges with South Africa on that front. You know, South Africa is not exactly the best climate to produce some of the things that we are producing. So we really need to start looking as we go forward about what it is that we should be producing for the climate that we do have, and maybe perhaps start looking at where we should be producing and where we have comparative advantage.
In order to the benefit of everybody.
Exactly.
John, are you positive about the future in terms of the value chain?
Oh, absolutely. We have a great agro-food value chain that's a major asset to this country. We should nurture and cherish it, make it more competitive, as Tabi said, to the benefit of society in general.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I enjoyed the conversation. You can also join the conversation. Visit our website, nationinconversation.co.za, or follow us on Twitter at NationConverse. Next week, we will look at unique South African products and the protection thereof. Please join us again. From me, Theo Foster, goodbye.
Nation in Conversation, proudly brought to you by Afgreen, Fort Knox, Hinterland, Monsanto, Nedbank, NWK, and Sendes.
The world is changing today. The world is changing in every way. Let's stand together, put our hands together, join hands forever. We're making it better. No matter where you are, you could be near or far away. We're singing together, we're dancing together, we're changing.